All right, everybody, we're back. We're in our second unit of the year. This unit is Medieval Europe. We are going to start that unit with this lesson, Feudalism in Western Europe. Now, as you remember, we left off with the fall of Rome, but remember the fall of Rome was really only in the West. The eastern portion, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, lasted for hundreds of years after the fall of Western Rome. Let's look at our big idea for our Medieval Europe unit, and it is conflict brings about changes. And our essential questions are, how well did feudalism establish order in medieval Europe? How does religion play an important role in shaping civilizations? How influential was the Roman Catholic Church in medieval Europe? How do civilizations adapt and change after conflict? And finally, how did events in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought? Well, let's get started. First of all, Western Europe, what we're talking about is this area. All these kingdoms that you've been mapping that you can see behind the word Western Europe is what we're talking about. Well, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we got a lot of chaos in Western Europe. A lot of people fighting for power, a lot of people trying to be in charge, different kings, different factions, different groups fighting each other. Remember Clovis, right? We talked about Clovis being a Frankish king, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, he kind of took over in the western area of Europe. A couple hundred years later, we have still looking to control all the chaos. We have Charles Martel, otherwise known as the Hammer, as another Frankish king, and then later his son Pepin the Short, which actually he wasn't short, but just a nickname. And then finally, we have Charlemagne. Charlemagne is one of your vocabulary words, and Charlemagne was the son of Pepin the Short. And let's talk about him a little bit. Charlemagne did unify Western Europe. He was a devout Christian. He had monasteries and churches and schools actually built. The irony about him having schools built, he was most likely illiterate. He did force Christianity on those he conquered. He had governors called counts. He was really organized. He was tall and athletic. He set up laws. He had 50 big land conquests, and he actually loved astronomy. So you're going to need to know a little bit about Charlemagne as we move on. Now, even though the West was unified, that didn't mean they weren't without their problems. They had outside forces coming in to invade the West, and we have three in particular, the Magyars and the Muslim groups coming in, and then also Vikings. And the Vikings were pretty fierce warriors and pretty fierce fighters. So in order to help control Western Europe and to help fend off some of these larger empires coming in to try to take over, what developed was something known as feudalism. Feudalism is another vocabulary word, and I'm going to talk for a couple slides about feudalism. First of all, feudalism is a system set up where there's a king at the top, and then below the king there are lords, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later. The lords pledge loyalty for land. And then underneath them, we have lesser lords or lesser vassals called knights. Knights pledge loyalty to the lords, who pledge loyalty to the king in order to gain land. And then finally at the bottom, we have serfs. Serfs are not slaves, but they are not highly esteemed, and they're actually looked at as part of the land. And let's get into that a little bit more in a minute. So first of all, we have a king who reigns over the entire land, and what he does is he will give out a piece of land, and on that land, a lord will build a manor. And a manor is either a castle or a large house and a large area of land. So if you can imagine, we live here in Nipomo. If Nipomo was a manor, the whole city of Nipomo, or we're not really a city, but the city of Nipomo would be a manor, and maybe you could say like Nipomo High School was the castle, and that's where the king lived or the Lord lived and ruled over all of Nipomo. So let's look at what the kings do. So the kings, or in this case Charlemagne, run the entire land. So they are in charge of everything, and everything that happens goes through the king, and they are in charge of keeping order. Again, there's a lot of chaos going on, and they're trying to keep safe from different empires and different people coming in to invade Western Europe. So the kings are there to make sure that they can help keep the land and help keep it safe. Second, you have lords. Lords receive a fief, and the fief is or pledge their fiefdom or their fealty. That is, they pledge their faith, they pledge their loyalty to the king, and in return, they get a piece of land to rule over. Now, how this helps is they are pledging loyalty to the king at the top, and the king can't be everywhere. The king can't be throughout the entire kingdom, but a lord can kind of serve in their place in another part and help of the kingdom and help defend that portion of the kingdom. And again, they plead their fealty, which is loyalty, and they receive the fief, which would be their land that they would get for their loyalty. Next, we have knights. Knights also pledge their loyalty, but they pledge their loyalty to either the king or a lord. So a lord might have several knights. The king has his knights. The lords will have their knights as well in their different manners. Another vocabulary word, chivalry. The knights practiced something called chivalry, which is a code of honor, a code of ethics that the knights live by. We'll talk about that more in class, but you need to know that chivalry is a code of honor followed by knights. Finally, at the bottom, we have serfs. A serf is someone who works in a manor or works in, for instance, in the king's castle. They're the people that are the bakers, and they work in the fields. They do the cleaning. They do all the jobs that most of the other people don't want to do. They are not necessarily slaves. They pledge their loyalty in order for protection to live in the manor system. However, they can't move up out of those rankings, and they are also considered part of the land. So, for instance, if a lord owns a manor and then somehow gets to go buy a different manor or move to a different manor, the serfs in his first manor would stay with that manor. They would be part of that. They would come with it. So when the next lord bought that manor or moved in, they would get those serfs as well. So they're at the lowest of the rankings. I'm going to go back a couple slides. And the last thing about this feudalism system, everybody is kind of stuck in their role in the feudal system. So in order to be king, you have to be a family member of a king, oldest born son of a king in order to be king, unless you took over somebody's land and made yourself king. Second, a lord, same thing. You have to be the son of a lord in order to become a lord. Knights kind of work in the same way. They go through a process of becoming a knight, but really, knights are only people of noble blood. You don't really have people moving up from peasantry into knighthood. And finally, serfs, well, they're destined to just end up being serfs for the rest of their life, and their kids are going to be serfs after that. So that ends this podcast on feudalism. Make sure you study your vocabulary words, and we'll see you in the next one.